So, welcome back to already the last session of the New Voices Latin American Women Philosophers. This evening, we are welcoming Silvia Manzo. She's a research scholar of the National Research Council CONICE in Argentina and teaches early modern philosophy at the Department of Philosophy, Faculty of Humanities and Sciences of Education at National University of La Plata, Argentina. She did her undergraduate studies in philosophy at the National University of La Plata. Her doctoral research on Francis Bacon's matter theory was carried out at the University of Regensburg, the University of Hamburg, and Herzog August Bibliothek Wolfenbüttel. In 2000, she received a PhD from the University of Buenos Aires. Manzo is also a founding member of the Red Latino American de Estudios sobre Filosofías en la Historia and coordinates research projects focused on revising the philosophical canon. The current research project, Women Philosophers in History, New Readings of Early Modern Natural Philosophy, Metaphysics, and Anthropology, reflects this commitment to expanding and re-evaluating historical narratives within the field of philosophy. And today she is presenting a talk on Elvira López and the emergence of feminism in Argentina. Thanks, Silvia, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jill, and thank you, Pedro, for the invitation and organizing this series. Just want to say that I'm not an expert in 19th century Argentinian feminism, but I'm very interested in this topic and just beginning to know about this movement in Argentina at this time of the year of the history. And also that there is some work done already by other colleagues from philosophy, history, and sociology on the work of Elvira López. But in about over the last 30 years, there has been published some works. I was lucky to receive this year a recent publication by two colleagues from philosophy, which are María Luisa Femenías and María Cristina Spadaro, who published a biography of López, which was really very important for me. But still there is much to be studied regarding this author, and so I hope to make a contribution. Of course, what I'm going to share with you is just a draft, a work in progress, in which I present some interpretations that should be considered more as hypotheses that need to be confirmed. So Elvira López was born in Buenos Aires in 1972 and died there in 1956. She was daughter of Cándido López, a painter and photographer very famous in our country for having captured in his paintings scenes from the Triple Alliance War, in which he took part as a soldier. However, her father does not seem to have been a major presence in the family, nor does he seem to have influenced Elvira López's philosophical and political interest. On the other hand, it was her mother, Adriana Wilson, to whom the author dedicates her thesis, a very strong influence in her life. Born in Uruguay into a family of Argentinian British origin, Adriana was a woman of progressive and liberal ideas who deeply influenced her two daughters, both of whom were really very engaged in feminism in Argentina. Elvira studied at the Colegio Nacional de la Capital, where she graduated as a teacher in 1891, and after graduating, she taught at the same institution. In 1896, together with her younger sister Ernestina and two other women, she enrolled in the newly created Faculty of Philosophy and Letters at the University of Buenos Aires. She decided to study philosophy and wrote her doctoral thesis, which she defended in 1901 with the highest marks. She thus became the first doctor of philosophy, I guess, in Latin America, not only in Argentina, and was part of the third graduating class of the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters. The text we are going to analyze in this article in this paper, is her doctoral thesis on the feminist movement. For López, feminism was not just a subject of theoretical or academic research, but a political cause for which she fought for most of her life. Together with her sister, who graduated as a Doctor of Letters or Literature, she was very active in the various women's organizations that emerged in Argentina in the first decades of the 20th century, and was part of international feminist networks. Among other things, she was one of the founders of the National Council of Women and the secretary of the first International Women's Congress of the Argentine Republic, held in 1910. She was member of the Socialist Party, which was represented in the National Parliament and which promoted actions aimed at the social advancement of the lower classes, the promotion of decent working conditions, health, and education. López also participated in the creation of the Socialist Women's Center and co-founded the Association of University Women. She traveled to the United States and to Europe. It's not so we don't have precise information about this, but we are sure at least that she went to the States and also to Europe sometime. And there she had the opportunity, I mean in the States, to make contact with feminists, educators, and intellectuals from abroad. So she made teaching her livelihood and worked as a teacher of French language, philosophy, and pedagogy. Besides her thesis, in addition to her thesis, she published articles in academic journals. So you can see here the list, some journals of the University of Buenos Aires, on political sciences and also on law. And also she published some articles in other kinds of journals, so press or also political journals. He also has translated some short French pieces, which were anonymous published in a journal of education, which was called El Monitor de la Educación Argentina. We can see now the first edition of the thesis, which was published immediately after the defense in Buenos Aires in 1901. Her supervisors were Rodolfo Rivarola, which was a lawyer and which was the first professor of history of philosophy and then of ethics and metaphysics in the University of Buenos Aires, and Luis de Lepiane, who was more engaged with history or global history. So was the name of the subject at that time. Now you can see a second edition, modern edition, published by the Biblioteca Nacional. And it's worth noting that when after the centenary, the first centenary of the publication of the thesis, there was a special issue published by a journal of interdisciplinary journal of gender studies, published by the University of Buenos Aires. Now, the focus of my paper will be these four themes: the argumentative strategy of the thesis, the conception of feminism, the conception of women, and the question of motherhood. First, I want to talk very briefly about the historical and intellectual context when was which were the background of the writing and defense of this thesis. Regarding the general historical context, what is important to know is that between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, Argentina was undergoing a transition. The important 19th century wave of European immigration decisively changed Argentina's social composition. This involved a great economic growth, intense upward social mobility, and cultural modernization, not without problems and inequities. The new socio-cultural structure that was being consolidated by the end of the 1880s, governed by a republican government with oligarchic characteristics, gave way to a political order transitioning to a democratic republic. The 1912 implementation of male universal suffrage resulted in the election of the first government anointed by popular election in 1916. So that's about the historical context. As for the intellectual context, between 1890 and 1910, positivism was the hegemonic current in Argentinian culture, coinciding precisely with the period when the professionalization of philosophy in the university field took place. That means that philosophy began to be an independent career at the university precisely by the end of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century. So after this, during the first decade of the 20th century began to be the first properly called professors of philosophy. Before that, mainly the teachers, professors of philosophy at the university were lawyers or physicians or sometimes scientists, natural scientists. It is precisely positivism that, according to my interpretation, is the most notable influence that can be seen in López's philosophical approach. And I agree with a couple of scholars who claim that, but there are other interpretations which maintain a Kantian influence, which is said to be favored by the mediation of one of her supervisors, namely Rodolfo Rivarola. But I do not believe that this is something that can be reliably confirmed in the text. In fact, we do not find Kantian ideas or concepts in the thesis. Kant is just mentioned once and incidentally, and in addition, the sources on which we know that López relied to write the thesis do not have any Kantian references. Also, it is true that her supervisor Rivarola was the first professor to teach Kantian philosophy at the University of Buenos Aires. This new beginning, so to say, in the University of Buenos Aires started just after the writing of the thesis in 1904. And before that, Rivarola was also drawing on Spencer positivism. So with criticism, but he was not a Kantian still. So before she wrote the thesis, Kant was hardly known in Argentina. After some years, between 1910 and 1920, Kantian philosophy became predominant at the University of Buenos Aires. But there are other sources, and so that is part of my work, is much work to do regarding the sources. You can see that other sources that are named by her are Stuart Mill, John Stuart Mill, Ernest Lejuvet, Carlo Francesco Gava, Jenny Dericourt, Concepción Arenal, Paula Lombroso, Santiago Vaca Guzmán, Maria Celiga, Mary Dugard. I just named those who I think she really read, because across the thesis you will find lots of names, mention of many other authors which he discusses, but I have the suspicion, my impression is that she didn't read, for instance, Proudhon or even Spencer directly, but by second hand. So going to the parts, the main focus of my interpretation, first, the argumentative strategy. The structure of López's thesis allows us to see the argumentative strategy she chose. The thesis is made up of 16 chapters, an introduction and a conclusion. The chapters can be divided into 5 main thematic axes. 1, the situation of women throughout history in different cultures in the West and the East. Second, the concept of feminism and the women's question, the women's status, or the question of women equality and difference, we can say in more modern terms. Then the women's education. Next, women's economic, civil, and political rights. And finally, the feminist movement in general and its different manifestations in the world, including, of course, Argentina. As we can see from this structure of the thesis, López does not begin her thesis with an a priori definition of what a woman is. On the contrary, she begins with an empirical collection of women's characteristics based on the information provided by history and anthropology. This historical overview shows how customs and consequently women's rights and duties have changed throughout history. In doing so, López constructs a definition of women based on empirical evidence, the main aim of which is to show what their capacities were and are. In other words, it's a question of demonstrating their situability or capacity. I don't know if this is the right English word, but I mean, in my interpretation, he's trying to show what a woman is capable of. And at the same time, she does not fail to point out the fundamental role of education in women's capabilities. For without sufficient education, women's capabilities will remain mere potentials. In her review of different educational experiences for women in different countries around the world, she shows how, when women have the opportunity to be educated, they can fulfill different functions in society beyond traditional domestic roles. With this empirical historical evidence as a backdrop, the thesis goes on to consider what rights women are entitled to according to their properties. Thus, it first looks at the status of women and then turns to legal practice to assess whether the practice is in keeping with women's nature. And she affirms, for instance, and I quote, the present incapacity of the female sex for certain civil transactions. Incapacity in this point is legal incapacity. The present legal incapacity of the female sex for certain civil transactions goes back to very ancient times. Their incapacity is an effect and not a cause, a particular consequence and not a general principle. The wife, the daughter, the sister is the incapable one, not the woman. An important distinction which must be taken into account whenever one wishes to penetrate the mind of the legislator. So we can see here that she distinguishes what really a woman can and what is the decision of the legislation, which not always is in keeping with the real capacities, so to say, the natural capacities of women. Finally, the chapters of the thesis, the final chapters of the thesis refer to feminism as a movement, that is, as an organization at national and international level, which aims to win these rights. After demonstrating what are the rights that really belong to women, she claims So she goes to feminism as a movement to claim for these rights. And in these final chapters in particular, and also in the chapters on women's education, López provides a great deal of up-to-date information on the situation of women and the women's movement in various European countries. Her main source of information in this part, at least about the feminist movement, seems to have been the publication of Almanac Feminist, edited by the Polish feminist Maria Czeliga, who is several times mentioned by López. In her historical survey, López traces an evolutionary path from the most primitive state of humanity through ancient civilizations, Greece, Rome, Christianity, the Middle Ages, through modernity. The main source for these historical reviews seems to have been the work by the Italian jurist Carlo Francesco Gava, della condizione giuridica delle donne, studio storico, published in 1880. And López's historical review of the situation of women begins by pointing out the material condition of the struggle for life, to which the human species was subjected in its earliest times, and in which the inequality of physical strength between men and women was decisive for women ending up enslaved by men and considered inferior to them. We can see here some parallels with Simone de Beauvoir's account of the historical basis of inequality. She claims that because men were physically better able to provide for themselves in a wild natural environment, women, or the weaker sex, were relegated and just subjugated. The practice of male domination and the concomitant view of female inferiority were installed in subsequent generations and in all cultures. So not uniformly and homogeneously, but in varying degrees and modes of subjugating. López describes how the heterogeneity regarding gender roles and rights in families, relations, in work and education. Also, she acknowledged the recent anthropological studies that have shown the existence of relations of female domination in some peoples of the Americas, Asia, and Africa. She considers that these are exceptional cases. And we can say that when she speaks of women's slavery, she does not only mean the mere subjection of women to men, but also the sale of women who were forced to perform domestic or sexual labor, or who were completely subject to the decision of their husbands and their political families, as if they were their own property. Across the historical survey, López notes the evolution from the most primitive state of humanity to the French Revolution, when women's rights reached their highest point, and concludes, and I quote, "As laws have made women more independent and brought them closer to equality with men, harmony and freedom in the human family have increased. The more woman has been elevated, the more the ideal of the home has been perfected, and the less she has been a slave, the more moral she has been." This process of emancipation of women continues to her present day in the 19th century, with feminism developing unevenly and at different rates in different countries. In her view, the most advanced situation is to be found in the United States, where women are now, she says, absolutely equal to men. However, López also notes that even there, in the States, the socialist formula of equal pay for equal work has not been achieved. This, she says, is still an aspiration that has not been realized anywhere in the world. And given that the United States is, in her view, the most developed country in relation to feminism, is, in my opinion, an interesting case to analyze how she imagines or figures should be the ideal situation of women. For her, the American woman is a virile woman who does not recognize the existence of male superiority. In fact, I quote, men, sorry, I forgot. Oh, it's okay. Men who have never been able to subjugate her, that is the American woman, are now accustomed to consider her as their equal. North America, she argues, is the true cradle of feminism movement and is followed by the most advanced European countries like England, Sweden, Norway, and France. And she knows that Spain is more relegated, is not so much advanced in regarding feminism. And she explains that the difference we can see in the development of feminism in North America is related to the economic situation. She provides an explanation of that, claiming that women colonists spent a lot of time alone, were uncontrolled by male power, looking after their homes and children and families, with a religion that encouraged their freedom. So she was the mistress of the home, and she could devote it to the pleasure of the labors of the mind. Now, we can go now to the conception of feminism. In the introduction to the thesis, López presents us with an initial outline of the concept of feminism, which she will defend and uphold in response to the prejudices or misinterpretations that the term has received. The framework she has chosen is clear indication that in the Rio de la Plata region, I mean Argentina and Uruguay, at the end of the 19th century, feminism was already a subject of discussion and was becoming a political and social movement that was discussed in the press and in political and academic circles. However, since the author believes that the term has been misunderstood, she undertakes the apologetic task of defending the right meaning of feminism. And she does so by means of a typical philosophical tool, which is to draw the boundaries of a concept in order to define it as precisely as possible. In this introduction, she first outlines what feminism is not, making a clear distinction between the theoretical discussion of what feminism is as a concept, which is developed in chapters 3 and 4, and what is feminism as a movement, that is, feminism as a political action, which is developed in the last chapters of the thesis. Starting from this premise, she argues that feminism is not a doctrine, but an aspiration that is absolutely dependent on the material conditions in which the human species finds itself. Hence, its fatal character, since it's part of the law of evolution which must necessarily be fulfilled. Here we see the strong imprint of positivism in López's perspective, and I quote, "Feminism cannot be called a doctrine, is not and cannot be. Rather, it can be considered a tendency or an aspiration, or better still, a necessity, a fatal result of the law of evolution and the economic crisis of the age." In maintaining the fatal and inescapable nature of feminism, or character of feminism, López is in line with other Argentinian writers of her time, which I have mentioned in one of the slides, regarding the sources, and other writers such as José Ingenieros and Ernesto Quesada, who saw the advancement of feminism as directly linked to modernity and progress. Both authors, who were very close to positivism, have the conviction of the existence of a law of evolution, of the necessity of progress, and of the struggle for life, a struggle that must be interpreted in terms of a biological struggle for survival, in the sense of Herbert Spencer. In this aspect of the characterization of feminism, it seems clear that López's approach inserts into a positivist framework. In her view, the conditions for the historical emergence of feminism are material and, more specifically, economic. The economic aspect she refers to is the need for women to leave the domestic sphere, to work and earn a living for themselves and their families. Men's wages were no longer sufficient to support the family. In this context, women entered the labor market, but under miserable and degraded conditions, receiving lower wages than their male counterparts and performing lower labor tax. This general idea applies to feminism in general in different countries. And in the case of Argentina, she claims that feminism is not yet very much developed. Argentina is a young, rich, and cosmopolitan nation, which, although is linked to the Latin tradition, but by its colonial origins, is also open to foreign influences. In this context, we can see how she links the emergence of feminism in Argentina with the economic crisis of the country. I quote, "It's only in recent years, when the struggle for life has begun to make the existence of the unfortunate woman more difficult, that her emancipatory mission has begun. It is here that feminism manifests itself above all in the economic sense. The woman who attends the universities and other educational establishments does so only in search of a degree with which to cope with misery, and works to carry out an independent position for herself in the wide field of activity which our generous laws offer her." Now I go to the conception of women. In chapter 3 of the thesis, López undertakes a brief theoretical analysis or examination of the conception of women, concentrating on the most recent and influential 19th century position. In doing so, I guess, as part of what I must confirm, she does not go directly into the sources she mentioned, I mean, Proudhon, Comte, Michelet, and so on, but she draws on the works of Carlo Francesco Gava, the Italian jurist, I mentioned it already, and also the French physician Jenny Ricoeur, who was very influential in French feminism. I was one of the authors who responded against anti-feminism, mainly, for instance, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. So López first presents the views of the two very influential French writers who she considers to be anti-feminist or anti-feminist: the anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and the positivist Auguste Comte. Proudhon was famous not only for his promotion of anarchism and his polemics with Karl Marx, but also for his strong support for the inferiority of women. His position in this regard was extreme, and highly criticized in his own time, mainly by Jenny Doricourt. According to López, the author's, Proudhon starts from a concept of women as an inferior being due to her lesser physical strength, to the point of considering her as an intermediate species between man and animal. According to Proudhon, the inferiority of women is manifested physically, intellectually, and morally. For López, the French anarchist holds contradictory and ridiculous position on the nature and role of women. I just go to the quotation of his remarks on Proudhon. I quote, "The fact is that Proudhon, irritated by the false doctrines of the emancipationists, allowed himself to be carried away by his polemic spirit, and went to the point of absurdity to combat them. But when he had calmed down, in his posthumous work on property, he presented a genuine retraction of his earlier attacks on the question of women. In any case, he says nothing worth mentioning about women's rights. He presented the pros and cons of the question without resolving it, although he contributed to make it known in its various phases. But this is not enough to refute the doctrine of emancipation. Since he acknowledged its existence, he should have said what scientific solution is required, which he did not do." After considering Proudhon, López makes a very brief reference to the position of Auguste Comte. She also ascribes to him contradictions, since on the one hand, Comte values women's role as mothers, while so positively value women as mothers, while on the other hand, he categorically states that they should not be allowed to engage in any activity or profession outside of domesticity. Finally, López lumps both authors together, arguing that their anti-feminism is a reactive response to the false doctrines of emancipationism, or the exaggeration of the socialist emancipationism. She thus suggests that there is a true, moderate, or prudent feminism to which she belongs. However, after explaining the conditions of exploitation and wage inequality of women workers, she explains that the exaggerated or simply ridiculous reactions of socialist and communist feminists must be tolerated because they arise from this situation of extreme injustice. In a sense, they are an ideal which, even if it fails, it illuminates the path of the right way of feminism. Another French writer analyzed by López is Jules Michelet, whose work La Femme, published in 1860, was considered a defense of the status of women. However, for López, he is a kind of dangerous friend who says, I quote a term of her, dangerous friend, who says nothing really concrete or real about the situation of women. López, after considering Michelet, takes the same position regarding him as Ernest Lejoubet, a well-known French feminist, very important in the first half of the 19th century, whose work Histoire morale des femmes was translated into English and Spanish shortly after the first French edition. Anyway, López criticizes him for saying, Lejoubet, for saying that women did not excel in intellectual tasks, which she denies, saying that if women did not excel in intellectual tasks, was simply because they could not do so, because they didn't have the opportunity. They didn't receive the right education. She seems to agree with Spencer in the idea of the difference between men and women, in the attribution of feeling and instinct to women, and in their predestined place in the home, based on a scientific biological explanation. But even so, Lopez does not agree absolutely with Spencer, in all aspects with Spencer, with the illustrious Spencer, as she calls him, because he does not explain how to solve the problems of women. In fact, a claim of her states that no philosophical antecedents have proposed the real solutions of the woman situation. In another chapter, chapter 4, she looks at the views of two women, in particular, the Spaniard Concepción Arenal, a writer, a feminist writer, and the Italian teacher or so engaged in pedagogy, Paola Lombroso. The former, Concepción Arenal emphasizes the need for a broad and deep education, and the latter argues for the need of specific education of women based on some biological considerations. Lopez's position does not fully identify itself with any of these precedents, but it draws on different ideas from some of them. She, just in passing, names Rousseau and agrees with him in claiming that men and women are equal in what they have in common, but are different and not comparable in what each has, they possess, he says. Like Stuart Mill, she believes that women's maximum potentialities are still unknown because they have not been able to show themselves due to their lack of opportunities. And like Spencer, she believes that women themselves are subject to the progress typical of the advancement of civilization. For Lopez, woman is neither inferior nor superior to man. She simply complements him. The idea she presents in the introduction to the thesis, in which she again quotes Le Jouvet, can be better understood against this background. I quote, "There is no shortage of people who say that feminism aims at equality between the sexes, which is absurd if we think that equality in this case means identity, but very fair if we recognize it as an expression of equivalence, or maybe equity. I don't know if the best word would be equivalence. Let us say with Le Jouvet, and she quotes him, no one pretends to assimilate woman to man. That will be the surest means of enslaving her. For a being placed outside her natural sphere is necessarily inferior and therefore subjugate. In this difference, far from being a sign of inferiority, we find the better reason for raising her to a better destiny." So, Lopez does not advocate equality between women and men in the sense of identity, but equivalence between the sexes. Although she recognizes sexual differences, she does not propose hierarchy between the sexes in terms of inferiority and superiority of women or of men. A final point regarding this theme about the conception of women is interesting to note her clear awareness of the difference between the formal equality that the law may confirm and the de facto exclusion that occurs in patriarchal customs. On the one hand, she says there is the civil code, and on the other hand, there is the terrible code of opinions or the public opinion. It is often the case, she says, that it's the public opinion, not the law, that restricts or expands the concept of the rights of women. Lopez is thus clearly aware of the difference between the order of customs, which is social, material, depending on customs or customary rules, which is called by her the code of opinion or public opinion, and on the other hand, the order of law, which is formal or political. And I quote, "In truth, it must be said that the female sex is more restricted in the exercise of its activity by custom and public opinion than by the law. It's public opinion and not the code or the civil code which widens or narrows the circle of women's rights." And finally, I just synthesize here what are the differential qualities of women. She offers a kind of abstract of this of her views at the very end of the thesis, and he talks about of the feminine element, which is characterized by women's special qualities of order, method, tidiness, perseverance, delicacy, foresight, and scrupulousness. To this, she adds a fundamental trait, which is the innate inclination of women to care for others, and especially motherhood. Now, I go to the last point of my talk. Although we find in Lopez the idea that domesticity and motherhood are natural to women, we find some nuances in this position. Some authors, scholars have claimed that maybe she is, in this case, prudent because she was aware of the conservatism of some of the members of the jury, of the doctoral jury, and maybe concerning the priority of motherhood in the life of women, she wasn't so much convinced about this, but it's more like an attempt to make to persuade or to get the approval somehow of the jury, of the member of the jury. For we can see that she affirms that it's undeniable that women was born for the home, that she reigns in it, and that this is the noblest aspiration of her soul. However, we also find a denunciation of the abuse of reducing women to motherhood, because sometimes, I quote, she is seen simply as a machine for perpetuating the species. And we also find that she echoes Concepción Arenal's critique of reducing women to merely of women receiving just domestic education. She claims that women must have an education that goes far beyond these functions. And she also claims that there are single women or widows who need to be educated to develop their potential outside the domestic role in order to earn a living. And moreover, this is all the more true in the case of those women with virile qualities, which he says, Lopez says clearly, are not monstrous qualities, are natural qualities. And indeed, one can say that he's talking about herself, because she never married, she didn't have children, and she developed a kind of virile life according to her meaning. Lopez certainly believes that there is a superiority of physical strength in male, the male sex, but women are inferior to men only in this sense. That is because, for that reasons, they are called the weaker sex, only in a physical sense. In this regard, nature puts limits to the activity of women. That is an idea that we find in López. And so motherhood becomes a function, I quote, that absorbs the better part of women's existence. That is why she believes, and I quote again, the maternal instinct, stronger than any education, will always remain intact in spite of everything. And as a result, women's role in society will never cease to be linked to caring for others, developing various forms of philanthropy. The higher their education, the better for themselves and for those who receive their care and help. So I have said before that she had wrote about philanthropy, and so taking a stance against the Christian or Catholic view of philanthropy as mere charity based on more on faith and a spiritual sense, and not on a political view of the rights of women and men. This another idea of philanthropy. So final remarks that, of course, are very provisory, but are just the beginning. On the one hand, I like to emphasize that López's thesis was constructive and oriented towards political action. It provides historical, anthropological, pedagogical, and philosophical foundations for bringing justice to society so that men and women can live equally. Her work is particularly concerned with education and law. With regard to women's education, she proposed a reform that should include content specifically related to women's interests in terms of their history, rights, health, and personal care. None of these reforms were immediately incorporated in the Argentinian education system. But in terms of rights, she proposed specific reforms related to labor and civil relations, some of which were considered by the Congress from 1911, and finally were incorporated into Argentine law in 1926. However, it was not until the 1980s that the law of divorce and joint custody was passed. On the other hand, I claim that the thesis of López was apologetic in that it defends the correct or right sense or meaning of feminism, and at the same time criticizes false or exaggerated feminist emancipatory claims. Although she recognizes that the radicalism of the latter is at least partly due to the circumstances of extreme injustice in which women were born, she believes that this kind of feminism is completely counterproductive and ineffective. Some scholars have described López's feminism as cautious or prudent feminism because it did not challenge traditional ideas about women's natural weakness and their gender roles as wives and mothers, and because it did not demand the right to vote for women in her country, believing that the time was not yet ripe for the precise exercise of that right. Certainly, the feminism advocated by López sought reforms that would gradually transform society. Only in this way, she believed, could truly effective social change be achieved. The supposedly revolutionary feminist breakthroughs were seen by her as a kind of ridiculous utopias that will never materialize. Thank you.